No matter what I am doing as a real estate investor, I have a silent partner, and his name is Uncle Sam. What a 1031 exchange allows you to do is to sell investment real estate, park the money with what's called a qualified intermediary. That's what I do. And then go and buy new investment real estate and not pay tax on the profits.
Sign me up.
No kidding, right?
You're listening to Copeland Morgan Media, your source for investment property analysis, education, and advice. Find us online at copelandmorgan.com. Well, welcome back, folks, and thanks for joining us. I'm your host, Jeff Copeland, and I am super excited to have in the studio with me today Dave Foster. Dave is the founder of the 1031 Investor, and as you might suspect, he is a 1031 exchange guru. But before we dive into that, I do want to mention that today's episode is brought to you by Savvy Mortgage in St. Petersburg, Florida. If you're looking for a local mortgage broker, then look no further than Tracy Mayo and her team at savvymortgage.com. So Dave, welcome to the Copeland Morgan studio. It's good to have you here in person.
Hey, awesome. Listen, the heat is on in here. It's 50 degrees in St. Petersburg. I'm happy to be anywhere where the heat's on.
Yeah, for those of you listening from elsewhere in the world, this is our week of winter in Florida, and so we're coping with these sub 50 degree temperatures.
You know, it's tough, but we'll get through it till next week.
Yeah, that's true. It doesn't last long. There's no snow to shovel, so I think we'll survive. So Dave, you are the 1031 guy. I think a lot of people out there have some notion of what a 1031 is or what it means, but there's a lot of complexity that goes into how it actually works. So why don't we start off with what is 1031? What do these numbers mean? Where did this come from?
Yeah, well, actually, let me just tell you my story.
Sure.
Because that's actually how I became the 1031 guy. Around about 1996, my wife and I were both on the corporate train, and this magical thing happened. We had our first kid. And at that point in time, all you want to do is throw the TV away and just look at this little bundle of joy. And you start to realize that the most precious commodity you've got in your life is not money, it's time. And so we began to think, okay, wait a minute, this is a paradigm changer. How can we rearrange our lives so that we can structure to have more time? And by that, we also mean then passive income that's not taking our time to earn, so that we can spend our time with these little guys we're starting to have. Can
I just interject that I actually love that point and that sort of train of thought that we all chase passive income. That's all everybody talks about. But when you really think about what does that mean, it means you don't have to physically or work for it. It's passive, which means you have more time to do the things you love, be it spend time with your family, sail around the world, retire, whatever the case may be. But what passive really buys you is time not spent working. That's a great thought. I love that.
That's exactly right. Or time that is spent working, but working at what you love.
Yes, well said.
And that's so that was where we were heading, which I think is just so applicable to this market, which I've really kind of dubbed it's the rise of the passive investor. The internet has made the world very, very small. And it's as easy for us to see investors from California buying properties in St. Pete as it is in LA, because the world is your oyster now. So that was what we were trying to do way back before there was this small world. But like investors today, Dave decided to ready, fire, aim. And I said, let's become real estate investors. So I bought a duplex in Denver, fixed it up, sold it, made a nice profit, and said, oh yeah, this is what we're going to do. Till I met with my accountant. And I hear that evil laugh, right?
Yeah, well,
exactly.
So many people start off flipping houses, and it feels so good when you make 20, 30, 40K on a flip. That's awesome. And then you have to pay the tax man at some point, at the end of the year or April or whatever the next year, you sit down with your CPA or your QuickBooks or whatever, and you realize, holy cow, out of that 40K I made on that flip, 10 of it's going back to the tax man.
Yeah, well, and in that case, in our case, it was almost 50%.
Wow.
And it was at that moment that I realized no matter what I am doing as a real estate investor, I have a silent partner, and his name is Uncle Sam. And quite frankly, that just did not sit well with me because I worked a lot harder than he did,
Sure.
and he made as much money. So we regrouped and said, okay, that worked, but not as well as we need. What can we do?
Necessity is the mother of invention.
Exactly. Right at that moment, this incredible thing happened. A 25-year lawsuit against the federal government and the IRS by a taxpayer named Starker was finally settled in his favor. And that was over this thing called the 1031 exchange, which has been a part of the tax code for over 100 years. But with this court case that went all the way through all the federal appeals courts and everything, nobody was going to do them because nobody knew how it was going to pan out. And right at that same moment, it was settled in his favor.
That's interesting because in some circles, you still hear it referred to as a Starker
exchange. That's exactly right. Yeah, what this guy did was he sold a bunch of timberland and left the money with the buyer on the agreement that they would, whenever he told them to, advance the money to go buy a property he located. He said that was a 1031 exchange. The heirs disagreed. They hassled for 25 years. Finally, he won, and there were new regs that were issued because of that. And now it was going to be available for folks like you and me. And when I read what it did, I went, oh, this is it. Because what a 1031 exchange allows you to do is to sell investment real estate, park the money with what's called a qualified intermediary. That's what I do. And then go and buy new investment real estate and not pay tax on the profits.
Sign me up.
No kidding, right? And of course, right at that moment in time also, I had some really good friends. You know who those good friends are, right? They're the ones that always have your back and always mock you mercilessly. So after they got their pound of flesh out laughing at my tax bill, they said, Dave, we're starting a business as a 1031 QI. I said, yeah, sign me up twice. I'll do them for myself. I'll do them for others because I could see what that was going to mean when I progressed my portfolio and career down the road 30 years.
Well, in your example, it was 50% more. That's 50% more real estate you can buy, 50% more equity you can build, and it cascades from there.
Exactly.
Over the years.
And so that was how we got the start. And we turned that into a 10-year goal to actually, we ended up doing some other things we can talk about later if you want, converting properties from investment into primary residences, turning the money tax-free. And at the end of 10 years, we bought a sailboat for cash, tax-free, and we had passive income from our investments, and we were able to go and raise our 4 boys on a sailboat.
That's incredible. I actually didn't know that about you. That's cool.
So I
definitely do want to come back to that because I've had this discussion with you before about how to 1031, and then later on you make it your primary, and that there's some tax benefits to that as well. So I definitely want to come back to that. But going back to your story, were you a CPA at that time? And I should have mentioned you are a CPA first and foremost.
I'm a degreed accountant.
Okay, perfect.
That's kind of like the difference between being an officer and a master sergeant. You know, I work for a living. The officers don't. Now, the difference is CPA passes the test,
right,
and they audit public books. I never wanted to do that. I never wanted to do taxes. But I wanted the accounting degree
absolutely
to be able to help myself and others. So I am a degreed accountant, and that's what we do.
Okay, but you were an accountant at that time when you started and got into these
Correct.
1031 exchanges.
Correct,
and
exactly.
That was 20 plus years ago?
Yeah, yes.
So you've done a few 1031 exchanges.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, all joking aside, how many would you say that you've done?
You know, as a clustered group, we passed 100,000 exchanges, I think 4 years ago.
Wow. So you've seen it all.
No. Every time I say that, I see something else, so I'm very careful.
Yeah, I'm the same on the property management side. You think you've seen it all until something, you're like, what? That's a new one. So tax-free money. I mean, sign me up. What do I have to do? How does it work?
Yeah, no kidding. Well, because what's so awesome, you want to think about this as a form of compound interest. And what we do, and I wish I would have thought to have had this up so we can, maybe we'll post it on your website.
Sure.
But we've got an Excel series of slides that will show you how it's simply in 4 transactions. 2 investors who do the exact same thing with the exact same properties at the exact same rates of return and profit have a vastly different income over 20 years.
Sure.
One investor does 1031 exchanges. So they end up building up the tax that they owe, which can be daunting, scary. But the other investor doesn't do the 1031 exchange. They pay the tax as they go. So at the end of 20 years, they don't owe anything. At the end of 20 years, the first investor will owe $500,000 in taxes. Now, they don't have to pay them right then. As long as you own the property, you don't pay the tax. But that's kind of looming, right? But here's the kicker. In those 4 transactions, the investor that owes $500,000 in tax controls a portfolio of almost $12 million of real estate. The investor that was not able to use that $500,000 and paid the tax doesn't owe anything, but they only control about $3.5 million. So when you're able to take the tax and use that to buy money to make profit on, and then take the tax from that and continue that forward, that's compound interest, and that's the big game changer.
Well, and you could see how that math works out easily. In your example, it was 50% taxes. Well, if you save that, it doesn't take you long to double or quadruple your holdings in real estate.
Exactly right.
And this is, I'm probably jumping ahead of myself here, but you brought up the point that you're deferring the tax. Technically, the tax is still due someday, but correct me if I'm wrong. The kicker is when you die and you leave that real estate portfolio to your heirs, they inherit it at that stepped up basis.
So before we get into the deep weeds, we got to talk about the 4 Ds of 1031 investing. So remember, the premise is you're selling investment property, buying investment property. We'll talk about the in-between in just a minute. By doing it that way, you get to indefinitely defer paying the tax. And these are the 4 Ds. Everybody who's listening, get ready to write them down. D number 1, defer. Sell a property, go buy a property using the 1031 process, defer the tax. D number 2, defer. Anytime you later sell that property, do a 1031 exchange. Anytime you want to go to a different class of property, like the transition that some of your folks make from single-family rentals to multifamily,
Sure,
or to commercial. It's a natural progression of our life's journey as real estate investors. Anytime you do that, do a 1031 exchange and defer. Defer number 3. I just broke it. D number 3, defer again. Because you can convert, and we're teasing people again, but you can convert property from investment into your primary residence. That doesn't create a taxable event. You can also do refinances of property you own and pull money out tax-free. The profit and tax stays deferred. You can also use these to position yourselves into vacation rentals. Got a few of those down here, don't we?
sure.
So again, without paying a penny in tax, you defer that, and yet you end up with a property that you generate income off of and that you're able to use yourself. So those are the 3 Ds. The 4th one, what do you think it is?
Die.
There you go. Exactly correct. Because when you die, your heirs do, under current law, get a stepped up in basis, which means basically the IRS translates it that they paid market value for that property on the day they died.
Or the day you died, your heirs, if they inherit your
On the
$1
day-
million
exactly.
property, the IRS sees their cost basis as $1 million. So
And it
if they
goes up-
sold it that day, 0 tax because there's 0 gain.
That's exactly
They keep it-
correct.
if it goes up to 1.2 and they sell it, now they've got a gain on 200K, not on 1.2.
But the day they get it, the tax disappears. So it does go away. So people who tell me, yeah, Dave, I'm going to have to pay the tax anyways, what's it matter? Well, you really don't,
Right.
unless you choose to get off the train.
Well, it's not always by choice, but point taken.
And by the way, be very careful, Jeff, about telling your children about this. I've got one who was thinking about changing to med school so they could learn how to shut off machines, I think.
I wondered where you were going with that. That's a good point. So again, I do want to come back to the owner-occupied off-ramp that you discussed. But first, let's dive into the nuts and bolts of the 1031 exchange, because it's not quite as simple as I sell this property and I buy that property and I just don't pay any taxes. That could get you in trouble if you don't do it right.
Yeah, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Not true. I'm here from the government and this is going to be easy. That's right up there with that other saying. So the 1031 exchange involves a bunch of hoops that you have to follow. There's really 6 of them. And if you don't meet one of them, your entire exchange dies. So meet 5, close enough is not good enough for the IRS.
Sure.
So I love to live in the world of close enough for horseshoes and hand grenades. The IRS, not so much. So those 6 things all have to be met. And that's what the QI has to be your guide through.
And just for any folks listening who aren't sure what you mean by QI is Qualified Intermediary. That is your 1031 guru person company who takes the funds and holds them. So because you're not allowed to touch the money from what they call a relinquished property, the property that you sold. So if you've already sold your property, it's too late for a 1031 exchange if you don't have a QI already in place.
That's exactly correct. And that's one of the biggest mistakes people make. The first requirement is that you use the services of an unrelated third party called the Qualified Intermediary, and their entire role is to document the exchange on the sale and on the purchase, and they have to hold custody to your proceeds. So if you wait until after you close and then call me and say, Dave, I'm ready to do my 1031, my answer is no, you're not.
Get ready to stroke a big check to the tax man at the end of this tax year.
Yeah. But in addition to that documentation and holding the proceeds, the QI is very important for you because they're going to be your guide for all of the other requirements that have to be met. So they're number one. Talk to them. There is so much strategy that can be put into play that I usually recommend to people as soon as you start thinking about where you're going, get a QI involved. Start talking to them about where you want to end up. Because the 1031 can place you there, but we all need a little runway to do it.
Absolutely.
So that's number one. So 1031 is only available for investment real estate. And by that, I mean real estate that you have purchased with the intent of holding. The IRS has a little different definition of investment than maybe you or I might. Like I would think buying a house, fixing up and selling it is investment. I mean, that's what I would think. But the IRS says that investment for them is property you intend to hold for productive use. So it might be a property you buy because you want to rent it. It might be a property you want to fix up to hold on to. It might be raw land that you're not going to generate income off of, but you're going to hold it until development catches up. But the bottom line is that if you buy the property primarily to resell it, it doesn't qualify for 1031.
So in our world of real estate investors who we work with, flippers don't count in terms of if you're flipping the house, buying it, selling it the same tax year. That's not an investment property in the eyes of the IRS.
That's correct. You can't do 1031s. But there's a way to flip it on its head. And that is simply change your model and extend your timelines. So instead of buying the property, fixing it up and selling it, buy the property, fix it up, and rent it. Or like a whole bunch of these guys I used to work with down south in Fort Myers used to do, they'd buy properties on the auction steps and just rent them. Didn't command top rent. They weren't worried about it. They didn't try to do something that was that improved. But what they did was they would buy them, put renters in them, and then in a year or so, the renter leaves, they fix them up, and then they sell them. That qualified for 1031 because their intent was to hold the property.
And as I understand it, this is not a hard and fast rule, but it's sort of a general rule of thumb: is you keep the property a year and a day so that it spans 2 tax years and generate income from the property. It's kind of hard to say that's not investment property by the letter of the law.
Right. Yeah, as a general rule, that's exactly right. There's no statutory holding period. It all is what your intent is. But the more elements you can have that show your intent, the better you are.
Sure.
So that's the first requirement. There's a couple timing requirements, and these are very problematic.
Before we jump into that, I want to just hit on one more point for the flippers and the alternative model for the flippers. And I think you kind of laid it out, but the idea really is to shift your mindset. You flip the house, but then you rent it for at least a year, rent it to tenants. And then if you sell it, you do have the option of a 1031 exchange. And so many people are talking about this, the BRRRR method. You buy, renovate, rent it, refinance it, pull your equity out, and then usually the last R is repeat. You go do it again. But if you have these kind of on an ongoing cycle, and after you hit that year or so of holding them, you also have an option to defer your tax and scale up to something bigger if you choose to, and you have a 1031 exchange becomes an option for you then.
Yeah, there's actually so many good things that happen when you slow down just a little bit, because that refinance is not a taxable event, but you get to write off the interest on it. So you get access to your money. There's a tax write-off on the interest that offsets. And what can you do with that? Go buy another property.
Sure.
Get started fixing it up. You also, when you hold property for a year, you're allowed to start depreciating it. And depreciation is a tax write-off that the IRS gives you. Every year you own a property, they let you write off 1/27th of it as a tax write-off. So you're generating income from rents. The income from rents is offset by depreciation and your expenses of ownership. So you really don't pay much tax at all on the income. And yet you're still able to refinance and go buy more property to do the same thing with. So you're really not slowing yourself down a whole lot.
Sure. Yeah, I was just talking to somebody about that the other day, that little gray area or that sweet spot where you are cash flow positive on a monthly or an annual basis, but then you take that depreciation expense that the IRS just gives you and it puts you in the negative. And now you're actually taking a loss on the property on your taxes, even though you didn't technically take a loss.
The same amount of money in your pocket.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Who doesn't want that, right?
Sure.
No tax bill, money in my pocket. I'll take it.
So we went off on a little tangent there. You were talking about the steps of the 1031 exchange and the timelines that come along with it. These are crucial, and these are tricky in a strong seller's market. So I think that's a really important point.
Well, that's just right. There's a poison pill with the 1031, and that is that the best time to sell a property, to start at 1031, is a market like this. You're commanding top dollar. But that's also the worst time to try and find your new property. It's hard to do. Well, so you think, okay, but the problem is the reverse is true as well. The worst time to try and start at 1031 is when you're in a buyer's market, because you're not going to get top dollar. But that's the best time to finish because there's tons of property available. So no matter where you're going to be, at what part of the market you find yourself, there's going to be different challenges to the 1031, particularly when we're talking about these 2 timing requirements. So you just kind of want to identify where you're at in the market. And as I say, take care of the hardest job first. And here's what I mean by that. From the day that you close the sale of your old property, you only have 45 calendar days to identify your potential replacements. Okay?
The kicker, though, and I want to repeat this because I know where you're going with it. 45 days from the day you close on the sale.
That's correct.
So I know where you're going with this. The key is find those replacement properties first, because that's the hardest job.
Bingo.
And don't close on your relinquished property until you're ready to pull the trigger on the others.
That's exactly right. You want to try to be under contract as soon as you can, because once day 45 passes, you can't change your list anymore. You're stuck with what's on it. Well, you and I were setting up. I literally fielded a text from a person who had her only property on her 45-day list, fell through. She was past day 45. She said, I guess I need to cancel and get my money back. I said, well, that's right. but it's going to take you 180 days because that's the exchange period. She said, I got to wait 180 days. What can I do? I said, keep your eye on that property because it's on your list.
Still on your list, and you still have 180 days to close on it.
Her text to me literally while we were setting up was, you were absolutely right. The property fell through because of appraisal. It's back on the market. We're a cash offer. We're going to get it.
Awesome. And I jumped ahead there to the other timeline, which was the 180 days.
Yeah.
So.
But back to the 45, you're absolutely right. So the key is don't identify a property without getting it under contract before the 45 is over because you're not going to get it.
Well, in this market, especially in a strong seller's market, which much of the country is in, and hopefully someday, 10 years from now, or they'll be listening to this podcast and the market will have shifted and this will all be irrelevant. But right now and for the foreseeable future, it's a strong seller's market and it's very hard to find attractive properties, and many of them are gone, or at least they're under contract and pending within 24 to 36 hours on market. So
right. And there's actually this illusion that it creates that if I name several properties on my list, I'm safe. No, you're not, because you're going to negotiate on one, and if you don't get a contract on it and it's a week later, options number 2, 3, and 4 are already gone.
Yep.
That's just how it is. So try to get under contract during the 45 days, or like you alluded to, there is nothing that says you can't go under contract before you close the sale of your old property. So you're absolutely right. The hard job is buying. So let's try to get that property under contract and then immediately put our old property on the market to sell.
Yeah, I know you always say if you can close on the relinquished property and close on the replacement property within that 45 days, you're golden. You can never have a timing issue if you time it like that. One thing I wanted to point out, and I tell people this all the time, in this market, in such a strong seller's market where it's so hard to find properties, find out what the seller wants. Find out what the seller needs. We always assume it's purchase price, it's money. But if you want to do a 1031 exchange, and I know that, and I say, hey, I may not be able to give you, 20% of our asking, but what I can give you is a 90-day contract. That gives you 90 days to go shop for your replacement properties. And as soon as you find them, I'm ready to close. That is huge to a 1031 seller. So if you're a buyer out there, make sure your agent is finding out what does the seller need. If it's cash, you can't, that is what it is. But sometimes it's time, and time is very important in these 1031 exchanges. And there's a lot of people doing exchanges right now because their property values are high, but they're scared to death of that 45-day timeline. So if you come in and say, hey, I'll give you 90, 180, whatever, I'll give you a long timeline to go under contract. Now, granted, you get rid of your inspection contingencies and stuff like that, but there's nothing that says you can't be under contract for months. But make sure the seller knows as soon as you're ready, we're ready. And that's a huge benefit to a lot of sellers.
There's a huge benefit in there to the buyers as well.
Yep.
And that is that what buyer wouldn't want to lock up a property today and not have to pay for it for 90 days?
Yeah.
Because when I do that at current rates, if I go 90 days, that's roughly 6% appreciation.
Yep.
So I'm paying today's dollars to get a property that's worth 6% more.
Absolutely.
It's a huge deal.
Yep.
Great advice.
Good little nuggets of wisdom we're throwing out here.
Yeah. So now you've got a total of 180 days from the day you close your sale to complete your purchase. That's not so much an issue in this market, of course, but you just want to know that it's out there. But the 45 far and away is the biggest timing issue.
That's the biggest hurdle.
Yeah, exactly. Now, we talked about the involvement of the QI. There are some titler requirements. You can't just change entities and change titling willy-nilly. That's really got to be examined by your QI to make sure that the taxpayer is staying the same. If Dave Foster owns a property, that property is reported on Dave Foster's personal tax return. So Dave Foster needs to sell and buy. But in today's age, we've got this whole generation of liability mitigators.
The LLC.
Yeah. So we create different entity holding structures, and that's all good and well. But they've got to be consistent as a taxpayer throughout.
Yeah, so if Acme LLC owns the property that gets sold, the relinquished property, Acme LLC to the letter has to be the company or the entity that buys the replacement property has to be the same tax ID, the same EIN, the same entity.
Exactly. There's some exceptions to that depending on what type of LLC it has. But again, that's the question for your QI and your accountant to say, help me through this. But the other thing is that there's a huge potential benefit because still today, so many lenders, some will not allow you to borrow money when the property is in an LLC. They want to require you take title to it personally. Well, that can raise some issues. But there's really just as many lenders in America that do the exact opposite, that require that it be taken in an LLC. So you got to ask the question, which one are you? And then work with your QI to help to mitigate that.
Yeah, I see. It's funny sometimes you'll see people who have done 1031 exchanges and you're a few properties down that road, but they had to keep the entity the same. So it's 123 Main Street LLC because they named it after the first property. But now 123 Main Street LLC owns 789 Central Avenue LLC. So it can get confusing if you name your LLCs after the properties. Years down the road, you do a couple of 1031 exchanges and there's no longer any relation to the name. So,
of course, if that would confuse a litigant lawyer, that might not be a bad deal.
touche.
The last of the requirements that have to be met, and probably the second most understood one, is about the reinvestment requirements. And what the IRS says that in order to defer all tax, you have to purchase at least as much as your net sale. And secondly, you have to use all of your cash proceeds to do that. So let's just take a real example. If I sell a property for $320,000 and there's $20,000 of closing costs and commissions, that would make my net sale $300,000. So if you want to defer all tax, you've got to purchase property or properties worth at least $300,000. If there was a $100,000 mortgage on that property, that would make your cash proceeds $100,000. You have to use all $100,000 in the purchase or purchases of your replacement properties. So that's the rule in order to defer all tax. Now, you can purchase less than you sell. You can take cash out. That's called a partial exchange. But when you do that, you're going to pay tax on the difference.
The boot.
The boot. Exactly. It's not going to affect the rest of your exchange,
right?
But you'll pay tax on that. Now, and what everybody wants to cry foul on, Dave, I put $20,000 down on that property. I want that back. Or I had to take $30,000 and improve the property before I sold it. I want to get that back. Well, it wouldn't be taxable if you're not doing a 1031. But because you're doing a 1031, the IRS looks at that and says, nope, you're taking profit. So what you want to call your $20,000, the IRS says it's profit. And they win the argument.
Yep, they win every time.
That's how it is.
And the benefits drastically outweigh the downside of that little down payment or whatever.
That's exactly right. So the idea would be two things. Number one, if you need money, go ahead and do a partial exchange. Take some cash out, pay a little bit of tax, still shelter the rest. There's nothing wrong with paying tax on profit. Sometimes.
Yeah, that's a good point, though.
I joke when I said that.
But there's a saying, and I tell my wife this all the time: if you don't want to pay any tax, don't make any money. Problem solved. But of course, we all want to make profit, and when you make a profit, you got to pay the piper. So
now, here's another idea, though, that I love. My clients love this one too. If you need cash, don't take it out of the sale. Do the full 1031 exchange. Sell the property, go buy new property, completely defer your tax.
And then refinance?
Immediately.
Yep.
Refinance.
Do a cash out refi at 3 or 4 or even 5% interest, and over the long haul, that's way cheaper than paying the tax man.
That's exactly right. Now, let me refine my example a little bit, because I want to talk about a type of exchange. Remember I said property or properties to meet the reinvestment requirements. So What's called a diversification exchange is where you sell one property and purchase multiple properties. And this is what people will do when they really want to stay in their lane and keep investing in the exact same kind of property. Bought a property for $100,000. I knew how to fix it up. I knew exactly what it was going to take. I knew the renters in that demographic. But now all of a sudden that property is selling for $200,000. What do I do? Because I don't understand $200,000 homes. Well, instead of buying a $200,000 house, go buy two $100,000 properties. Fix them up, put your renters in them, do everything you normally do, because that's what you understand.
Yeah, wash, rinse, repeat.
Exactly. But here's how those reinvestment requirements can really be tweaked to help you out. I'm going to change our example just slightly. You're selling it for $300,000 net sale, but there's only a $100,000 mortgage on it. So you've got $200,000 in cash and the need to buy $300,000 of real estate. Why? You can allocate your proceeds any way you want. So there's a way to kind of defensively invest against a market downturn in this as well. Go buy one property for $200,000 cash. Put a renter in it. You have no mortgage risk. All you've got to do, keep a renter in there to keep taxes and insurance paid. And no matter what the market does, you're not going to get hurt.
There's no better cash flow than the property that has no debt service.
Exactly. But the returns could be a lot better.
Sure.
So take the other $100,000 and use that as two $50,000 down payments on another $100,000 of real estate. Two more $100,000 properties.
Yeah, that's a great way to hedge your risk, because now the low risk, no debt service, paid off property gives you a little wiggle room. You might be cash flowing $1,000 a month on that, where the other two have to pay debt service, and they might be a little closer to break even.
Right.
But between the three of them, between the portfolio, they balance each other out. That's a brilliant move.
Yeah, and you bought those because there was an appreciation play as
Sure.
well. Absolutely. So that's a great way to defensively invest in there. And the other thing that it does is, don't forget, you're down the road a little ways, the market turns south, or you're just feeling saucy one day, you got a free and clear property that you can always refinance.
Sure. So you started this off by saying, sit down with your QI and probably your CPA and attorney and others, but sit down with your QI and figure out, where do you want to be at the end? What's your exit ramp? And so let's say my exit ramp is a house on the beach in Hawaii. How can a 1031 exchange or a series of exchanges help me get there?
Got it. So first of all, I got to ask you, why are you in Florida if you want to live in Hawaii? But
Fun side note, I have lived in Hawaii. I don't have any plans to move back to Hawaii. I just threw that out as a worthy goal.
Absolutely. So, yeah, well, let's pretend you're in Ohio, because that's fun, because every investor in Ohio has a commonality. Inside their garage, there's this thing called a snow shovel. I know you don't know what those are, Jeff.
I've never seen one.
Yeah, exactly. But, guy, you're in Ohio and you want to retire in Hawaii. How do I do that? Well, I'm going to say this, and I actually do believe this, although there are many who would challenge my take, because the world is a much smaller place because of the internet. But I'm a big believer myself in investing in my backyard. I know it. I see it. I can touch it. I can talk to property managers. It's good. But no matter what, at some point in time, I'm going to want to spread out. But initially, I'm going to say that this person, you know what, Jeff? I'm going to back even a step further. This is fun. I'm going to talk about two people who get married. And they got married in their late 20s or early 30s, because we're getting married later and later.
Sure.
And when they did that, each one of them had a house. Now, when they got married, which house did they move into?
The bigger one, the nicer one.
They moved into hers, no matter which, because it was the only one that was clean.
Happy wife, happy life. Yeah. There's another nugget you can take away from this show.
What did they just become? Accidental real estate investors.
Right.
So they go along a couple years. That was kind of fun. We've made some money. Why don't we try to do that again? So they sell that property. They do their first 1031 exchange. They go buy a couple more. Then they go buy a couple more. Then they sell and go buy a couple more. They're diversifying, right? They're growing their portfolio. Now, at that point in time, some things are going to happen. Either, number one, they're going to wake up one day and they're tired because all of a sudden they've got so many properties, in which case they start selling two or three and doing what are called consolidation exchanges, taking the two or three and putting them into one larger property. That's a great strategy to start to create even more passive income because they can move into multifamily, they can move into commercial or industrial type properties, they can move into things where there's on-site management, or they can create opportunities with management companies. All of that works so well when you're doing the diversifying and consolidating with the 1031. But either they're tired or they want to change classes of real estate. And this is when they can start to look more nationwide because the world is your oyster. At least the United States is your oyster because 1031 is U.S. property for U.S. property.
Sure.
But they start to move along their way. And they always keep in the back of their mind the retirement house in Hawaii. So a few years ahead of retirement, they decide, you know what? I'm done with all these properties in Cincinnati. Let's sell a bunch of them, and we're going to go buy a vacation rental property on Maui with a 1031 exchange.
I can see it in my head, Dave.
It's on VRBO. It's Airbnb. It's managed. It's beautiful. And because the 1031 exchange specifically allows it, they can use that sum for personal use every year. So when the snow shovel has to come out, they go visit the condo in Hawaii. Absolutely. So they position themselves. Now, they've got the rest of their portfolio around them. And remember, if they're me, they like to invest in their backyard. So they also do a series of other 1031 exchanges to move their property to Hawaii. Properties to Hawaii.
Their other rental properties.
Or they may choose to move them into passive fractional interests, like Delaware statutory trusts, which qualify, or properties where, like maybe here in St. Petersburg, where they can bring on a property management firm like yours.
Sure.
All of that's going to work because they don't have to be there. Where do they want to be? They want to be in Hawaii. A couple years have gone by. It's retirement time. So they sell the house they're living in. This is where it gets really fun. I lived here and I love this. Section 121 of the IRS code. This is bonus content. Section 121 deals with your primary residence. And when you sell your primary residence after you've lived in it for 2 out of the 5 years prior to sale, as a married couple, they would get the first $500,000 of profit tax-free. Where does that profit go? Into their pocket. So the first thing they're going to do is take an Alaska cruise. On that money, they're going to go buy they're going to buy a new car till they get over to Hawaii, I guess. But they're going to buy airline tickets for Hawaii, and they're going to move to Hawaii.
Where they already own a house.
And that is the house they're going to move into. Because you can convert a property from investment to your primary residence without creating a taxable event. So they've got the sale of their old house tax-free to start their retirement, and they're now living in one of their old investment properties, no tax due on that, and they have the rest of their portfolio generating income in retirement.
The 1031, 121 double whammy. I love it.
Exactly.
That's awesome. And so is there a minimum time frame where you have to hold that house in Hawaii as a vacation rental before you move into it in the eyes of Uncle Sam?
Just like the ability to do a 1031, there's no statutory holding period. there is a safe harbor given by the IRS at 2 years. If you rented it for 2 consecutive years, your use has been limited. They agree they're never going to question. But there are a lot of folks out there that say, well, 2 years really could mean anything more than a year and a day, because that's 2 tax years. There are other folks that say it truly is just about your intent and how you demonstrate that. So it's at the end of your investing and business life. If you don't want any question marks, just make it 2 years.
Sure. That's a brilliant strategy. I remember hearing you tell a similar story once, and just so many light bulbs going off about how you can map out a retirement strategy, just going from property to property to property, sell your primary, and move to retirementville, wherever that is for you. So,
well, that was the model that we used. It was even better for us because prior to 2008, you could convert a property, and then once you lived in that property for 2 years, again, sell it and take all the profit tax free. I mean, ka-ching, that was awesome.
As your primary residence.
Yeah. Since 2008, they changed the law so that now if that couple ever sells that Hawaii property, they have to have owned it for 5 years, they have to have lived in it for 2, and then they will only get to prorate the amount of gain between the amount of time they actually lived in it, that's tax-free, and the amount of time it was rented, they have to pay the tax on that, and they have to recapture depreciation. So it's not quite as sweet as it was, but it's still not a bad plan. It's just
still pretty sweet. So if you live there for 5-10 years and then you hit that final D and you die, your kids inherit the place in Hawaii at the value of the place in Hawaii with no gain.
That's exactly right. And what we did was, ahead of us moving, we had 2 strategic moves. We moved from Colorado to Connecticut because we had an opportunity there, and that was on the water. And we said, that could be the start of the sailing thing. We forgot when we were asking God to give us that dream that we really wanted warm water. And so after a year there, I was like, no, this is not going to work. But for the move from Colorado to Connecticut, we started selling Colorado investment properties and buying Connecticut investment properties. And then while we were in Colorado, we did a couple sales of primary residences. When we moved to Connecticut, we moved into one of the investments. We did it buy. Then our second strategic move was to warm water in Florida. And so again, we sold Connecticut properties. We bought investment properties in Florida, a couple of which were vacation rentals. And then when we were ready to move, we sold our last Connecticut property as our primary residence, moved into one of the Florida properties. And that's exactly how it works.
Dodging the tax man for 20 plus, 30 plus years. I love it. So you hit on this, but I want to clarify for anybody, because I see a lot of confusion about this. You know, if I sell a duplex, do I have to buy another duplex, or do I have to buy another multifamily? And the answer is no. You can sell a duplex. You can sell a single family home and buy an office building. You can sell a duplex and buy a farm. You can sell a duplex and buy, you know, an industrial estate or whatever. It's real estate for real estate, and that's correct. The like kind, and that's the like kind, I think, is what stumps people or trips people
up.
What
the IRS means by like kind is its use, and that's where we get into fix and flippers can't, even though it's real estate, because their use is not intended to hold for productive use. So any kind of real estate, like you said, can be exchanged for any other type of real estate. Now, when you mention duplexes, though, it's a whole other avenue here. Because this can be what we call the ultimate house hack. And that would be the person, you know exactly how primary residence financing works. There are several conforming and government guaranteed loans where you can put as little as 3.5% down, and as long as it is a property that has 4 or fewer units, you can get that kind of financing as your primary residence. So you could buy a duplex at the lowest rate anybody can get and live in one side and rent the other side. And you've got incredibly favorable interest rates. Now, a year goes by or a couple years go by. What's to keep you from moving out? But keeping that interest rate. You've satisfied the terms of the loan, and now you're going to go buy another primary residence. That might be a duplex. Put 3.5% down, get the favorable financing, live in one half, rent the other half. A couple years later, or a year later, you move out, and all of a sudden you look in your rearview mirror, you've got 4 rental units at the best financing available to anybody. That's a pretty good
and
gig.
you have lots of options because typically you have some
Right.
equity that's built up over the years. You have the option of doing a 1031 exchange. You have the option of taking advantage of a 121 and doing a primary residence sale.
Right. Yeah, that was the other half of that was if you wanted to sell it, you're going to get 50% of the gain tax free. And you can do a 1031
On the
on the other side. So you can actually combine those two statutes.
Awesome. Well, as I'm sure you can tell, Dave is a fun guy to sit down with and just sort of strategize. Say, hey, I own this, and this, but 20 years from now, I want to own this and this. How could I get there? And there's 80 different ways to skin the cat. But if you don't have a plan, you're like, what did you say at the beginning? Ready, fire, aim.
Fire.
Yeah.
Or no, it's ready, fire, aim. That's right.
So, I mean, I think what you do is you help people aim in the right direction and then help them know when to pull the trigger and time it right. And it's just I think it's underutilized by a lot of people in terms of a way to defer taxes and also scale up your real estate investing. It's huge.
Yeah, it was funny. I was being interviewed by somebody just a couple days ago, and his question was, Dave, what are the most common mistakes you see that investors are doing these days? And without even thinking, I said, well, every mistake that I ever made. But that's what I love to be able to bring to the table. I haven't seen it all. You and I will see something new next week. But being able to help people strategize and chart courses and maybe avoid some of the mistakes I had to make along the way is it's a good feeling. It's a feel-good industry.
So, Dave, I know people can find you at the 1031investor.com. Beyond that, what's the best way for somebody to reach out to you and do some of these little strategy sessions like we've been talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, actually, I've got this big box that floats around the screen on the homepage that says free planning session. We get paid to do 1031 exchanges. The prep work is part of the fun.
Sure.
So go there. You've got contact numbers for us. I think I've had like a 32-part YouTube series. So if you're awake some night, don't call me. Just watch some YouTube videos and you'll fall asleep quickly.
And you can find those at the 1031investor.com.
The1031investor.com. Exactly.
You brought up one other point. You get paid to do 1031 exchanges, and I don't remember what the cost is, but it's a pittance. You guys don't charge a ton of money for all this work.
Oh, I used to joke that we were going to be the smallest thing on the settlement statement behind the huge realtor commissions. And then all my realtor friends got mad at me. So now I'll just say, yeah, and a 1031 exchange for just a normal property should not cost you more than $1,000. It should cost you less than that. And when you compare just say a $50,000 profit, that's a $10,000 tax. So
you're paying hundreds of dollars to save tens of thousands of dollars in taxes.
And when people say, well, but what if I can't find a property? What if I can't do that? Well, there's no penalty associated with starting a 1031 and not completing it. You pay the 1031 fee, but if you can't find a property, you let it die and you pay the tax.
Yeah, you simply just don't report it on your next tax.
That's exactly right.
Tax submission, right? Your next 1040 or whatever.
But what we've done is we do internal anecdotal audits all the time, and we're seeing that even in this market, over 90% of our people that start exchanges are completing them with properties they like.
That's really good. Those are strong numbers.
Yeah. So if I came to you and I said, Jeff, I've got these lottery tickets. I'm going to sell them to you for $1,000 each. That's pretty expensive, right? But there's a 90% chance that you will be paid off $20,000 or $30,000 or $40,000. 90% chance of winning $40,000. How many of those would you buy?
All of them.
Absolutely.
A couple other points I want to hit on before we close. I know this as a real estate broker, but if you're the seller and you are doing a 1031 exchange and you have relinquished your properties and you have this money sitting in an escrow account with your qualified intermediary, it is as good as, or in some ways better than, cash. You are a strong buyer when you have 1031 money because the seller of the property that you're looking, the replacement property, knows that you're serious. They know that you have the money and they know that you have to close. And I had a deal last month where the buyer came to look at the property and he told me, I am on day 44 and I need to do a 1031 exchange. And of course, as the listing agent, I'm thinking,
Here's the here's who I'm looking
he's
for.
either going to pay us or he's going to pay the tax man. So you know what that choice is going to be.
Absolutely.
But yeah, 1031 funds are a close second or in some cases viewed better than cash by sellers. And it's such a strong market. Cash is king, but 1031 money is king also because they know you're serious and they know you're under the gun on these timelines to get the deal closed.
And don't forget the lenders. The 1031 proceeds are actually better than cash for lenders because the worst fear every lender has in America is that you as the borrower show them, in April, this bank account that's got $50,000 in cash. And in May, you forget to tell them you go buy a truck.
You bought the Maserati or
Exactly.
the boat or something. Yeah.
Try it. It drives them crazy.
Yeah, so they know you're holding
They
that
know
money
if the
in
QI
escrow.
has it, it can't go anywhere.
Yep. And then the other thing I wanted to touch on, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no certification, qualification, there's no license for qualified intermediaries. I mean, most of them tend to be accountants or attorneys or something along that line, but anybody could conceivably call themselves a QI because there's no licensing board, there's no people that police the profession, so to speak. So what should somebody look for in a QI to make sure they're protecting themselves?
Yeah, I can't make this stuff up. The IRS actually defines who is qualified to be a qualified intermediary by stating that they are qualified if they are not disqualified.
That is just the perfect government nothingness.
And what disqualifies you is if you have a family or business relationship with the client. So the barber down the street can be a qualified intermediary. They just can't be your qualified intermediary if they cut your hair.
Right.
So, yeah, it's in some ways it makes it feel like the wild, wild west. But the bottom line on it is that the only people nerdy enough to go into these things are typically accountants and attorneys, people like us who like to, as I say, go 2 miles deep in a 2-foot wide creek. We live in one little statute, and we're attorneys and accountants in our firm. All we do are 1031 exchanges. I can't do your taxes. Wouldn't want to anyways. We won't do your will. We won't represent you in your divorce. All we can do are your 1031 exchanges. So the best thing you can do to protect yourself is ask a lot of questions. How long have you been doing this? Let me talk to some clients. If they should be able to refer you to some title companies that have used them. That's a great source of referral. And find out how your money's being held. Make sure they've got the proper bonding, or in our case, we don't keep a bond because we have nothing to bond. We go the extra mile of creating individual bank accounts for every exchange. Can you imagine what that's like, having like 1,000 bank accounts open at any one point in time?
Well, that's why you're an accountant.
That's why I've got all the gray hair. But those accounts are in the name of the client. And that's why we do that. Because then nothing can happen to that money without their express signature. And because it gives them opportunity to get FDIC insurance.
Sure.
So you look at security of funds, you look at experience, and that'll get you through the nuts and bolts and paper transfer. But then in my mind, the other thing that's so important is, do they get me? Can they take me where I want to go? Will they answer my questions? And will I be talking to a senior person? Or will I be talking to the answering service more often than not?
Sure. just because your barber can do it doesn't mean your barber should do it. Find a good QI. Well, Dave, this has been awesome. We're coming up right on an hour, so perfect timing. Is there anything you'd like to close with? I have a few little closing questions, but anything you want to plug? Any new projects you're working on? Any big plans for Dave or for the 1031 investor?
Well, Dave is going to stay inside and stay warm this weekend. I may actually go shopping for a pair of socks, but I don't know that I'll be able to find them. I mean, it is Florida after all. No, I tell you what, I would love for people to be able to take access to the resources that we have at the 1031 Investor. That's why we put them there. And then don't hesitate to reach out. Love to work with y'all.
Even if you're not looking to do a 1031 exchange right now, you should be planning to do one someday. So now is the time to educate yourself. So a couple of questions I like to ask people who are in the real estate market, but in different, areas of it. Where do you see the Tampa Bay real estate market going in the next 2 to 5 years?
It's Florida in general. I'll start with that. I don't see going anywhere but up. Those of us in this thing in 2008, which we just call the bad time,
right?
The mantra that everybody was saying back then in Florida was, the baby boomers are coming. The baby boomers are coming. We promise they're coming. That's going to save us. No, they weren't. They weren't old enough. But now they truly are. So when you look at the net migration trends in America, the retirees and baby boomers are truly relocating here. In addition, though, so are all those crazy out-of-staters from every state that has taxation and legislation that they don't like. We're starting to see large numbers of Californians who are trading palm trees there for palm trees here. So I think that bodes really well for Florida in general. For Tampa Bay, this is what the second most densely populated county. No, it's the most densely populated county in the state of Florida.
Yes.
It's the most progressive. It's got all the critical mass of industry and entertainment. It's and it's got brew pubs and border collies on every corner. So it's incredibly attractive for folks from Austin, California, Colorado, who are looking to exit. I don't see anything but good things here for a couple of years for sure.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I have this conversation a lot, obviously, and most people are thinking along those same lines. But you brought up an interesting point that I haven't heard from other people. Maybe it's obvious, but we talk a lot about how the pandemic added fuel to the fire, and people are moving here in droves from the Northeast and the Midwest and even from California, like you said. But we forgot about the baby boomers. They've always been there. They've always been coming. But you're right. Now they're at that age where they're really coming, and that's on top of this other migration pattern we're seeing post-COVID or during COVID. With people who are leaving for other reasons. They're looking for a cheaper place to live where the cost of living isn't so high.
Let me warp your mind for a minute here. The things have reversed. It used to be that you would try to talk your kids into visiting you in Florida after you retire. The reason why the boomers are one of the reasons why they're coming here now is to visit their children who relocated here during the pandemic.
Yeah.
It's an actual trend. It's like, that's mind-blowing.
It is. That is warped. That's a good word for it.
Because, by the way, the pandemic is not allowed in Florida. We all know that.
Yes, we have opted out. So one final question, and you probably have shared so much wisdom here already, but what is one piece of advice or one tip or trick that you've learned over the years that you would share to an aspiring real estate investor trying to get started in Florida?
Trying to get started in Florida. You know what? Someone asked me this the other day. Particularly for Florida, I think the best thing you can do is you got to spend some time in the state. I've lived all over from Southwest Florida, Tampa Bay, Key West for a bunch of years, and the East Coast as well. There are probably 20 totally different environments and demographics in the state. From horse country in Ocala, where, by the way, the third largest number of cattle in America are in the state of Florida, near Ocala, to the beaches of the Panhandle, to all the funk and quirkiness that makes up Key West, to the Mouse in Orlando. And you'll find whether they're good spots for you to invest only by getting in and experiencing them. So that's my 2 cents for the Florida tourism industry. come down here and check them out.
Yeah, that's a
And
great point.
find-
Florida is so diverse. I mean, and so many people only come either to Disney or to the beach, and they think that's it. But there is so much more. That's a great point, and I think it's a great point to close on since we're at our time limit. But thank you so much, Dave. This has just been an incredible dive into 1031 exchanges. But the truth is, we really only scratched the surface. And so spend some time at the 1031investor.com. Give Dave a call, watch him on YouTube. There's so much to learn about 1031 exchanges. And when the time comes, find a qualified intermediary before you even list your property for sale. Get them on board early because they will guide you through the dark forest.
The dark forest and the IRS. That's a great analogy.
Well, with that, thank you again, Dave. And thanks everyone for listening.
Awesome.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Morgan Media Real Estate Podcast. As you can imagine, producing this great educational content takes a lot of effort and commitment on our part. We only ask one thing in return. Please subscribe to our podcast using your favorite podcast app or by visiting copelandmorgan.com/podcast. And remember, there's no greater compliment than referring us to a friend or colleague. Until next time, I'm Jeff Copeland.